Howdy howdy, welcome back to the swamp. Today we're going to be doing a little bit of an introduction to fungus and mushrooms. But whenever we're going to be working with mushrooms and mycelium and fungus, there's a few things we have to understand. And the first is that mushrooms are the reproductive organ, the fruit of the fungus, of the mycelium. Fungus is the organism itself, and mostly what makes up the fungus is going to be the mycelium. Those are those thin ribbony strands you might see below the soil, on top of the substrate, or ripping through, and you'll see the mushrooms kind of stemming from that. It almost looks like roots for some of the mushrooms. And so the fungus will fruit and produce a mushroom once it's further colonized enough. Maybe there's an external trigger. Something in the environment's going to tell it that it's time to fruit. And so then the mycelium kind of takes a bunch of moisture and stuff, starts to collect that into one area, and that's where it produces a mushroom, the fruiting body, the reproductive organ. And on the mushroom, depending on the type of mushroom, it can look in a few different forms, from gills to just different whole surfaces and pores and textures of sorts. Kind of hard to describe, but whenever you see a bunch of mushrooms in the wild, you know what I'm talking about. A bunch of mushrooms have a bunch of different ways of dispersing spores and just looking. The mushroom, once the organism triggers and produces a mushroom, the mushroom will grow, produce, mature, and then be able to produce and drop spores. Those spores, you need 2 of them to germinate and meet. And once they germinate, they're producing the mycelium in a slightly different form. And then once the 2 meet, they produce a slightly denser, full mycelium that is able to produce fruits. So then those 2 spores germinate, spread through the substrate, they consolidate different nutrients and water, and waiting for that external environmental trigger, whatever it may be, to then produce a fruit, produce a mushroom. The mushroom produces spores, those spores get spread, and so on. And so whenever we're growing mushrooms, we're just going to be working and producing reproducing that entire cycle, just in a controlled format with a few different barriers in between, so that way we can control our yields, control the growth speeds, the growth itself, the health, be able to backstock things, and really push things to their boundaries for yields, for speed, for their abilities to break down different nutrients. So depending on how we're going to be growing mushrooms and how we're looking to get into this and our level of interest, it's going to take a few different forms. And that can be anything from liquid culture, agar, grain spawn, or all the way to a fruiting block. And the fruiting block is probably the best place to start if you're a beginner and you're not really sure what's going on when it comes to mushrooms. All you have to do is slice this open and you can get started. It doesn't require too much information and knowledge about the organism itself. You can kind of just produce the mushrooms and see if that's something that you do enjoy, whether you like it for food or just the novelty of seeing them produce. Personally, as soon as you start growing mushrooms, for me, I haven't been able to stop. They're very fast. They respond to a lot of different triggers, whether that's in the agar stage, in the grain stage, or the mushrooms themselves producing. So we're going to run through all of these, but it's important to know that whenever we are working with mushrooms, whenever we want to grow mushrooms, really what we want to grow more often than not is going to be the fungus, and that's the mycelium, the vegetative state. And if we take care of that vegetative state, get it a good healthy start, and give it the resources it needs, it'll produce some really healthy mushrooms for us. So we'll run through these now and see what we got and see what each of these stages maybe looks like. Even though we're trying to fruit mushrooms, what we're really doing is working with fungus. And fungi, they're their own entire kingdom of life. For a while we thought they were maybe plants, then we realized maybe they're a little closer related to animals, and then really not that long ago we found out that they were related, or that they were their own kingdom. And so fungi became their own kingdom. The fungi are able to digest a bunch of different complex, hard to break down compounds like lignin or other kind of pesky industrial contaminants, usually often resemble lignin, but the fungi are able to break down these really complex, difficult things like dead wood that otherwise we'd be drowning in. And they do this externally as mostly the vegetative form, as mostly the fungus and the mycelium itself, where it's spreading as these thin little ribbon thread-like through often the substrate where we don't see it happening. And what they're doing is then externally producing compounds that are going to simplify and break down these different substances, different substrates that they're on, into some different simple compounds that the mushroom, the mycelium, the fungi itself can then absorb, as well as some other organisms can get in, some other bacteria and some other fungi can get into those areas that have been broken down and kind of further break it down and cycle it. So fungi are responsible for about 90% of the decomposition on Earth. Without the fungi, we would be drowning in trees. And for a while, we didn't have the white rot fungi that we work with. So that's why we have so many oil deposits and coal, because so much organic matter and just trees and biomass wasn't able to break down and just got buried and compacted all underground. And then eventually fungi were able to break down wood and figured that out. And so since then, they've been doing all of the regeneration, decomposition for all of Earth, and keeping our forest fed, turning those old growth trees that die, turning those into new life, into new fresh nutrients. So the fungus itself breathes out CO2, breathes in oxygen, so it makes them a really good partner for plants. But you also want to keep that in mind when working with them, when trying to fruit them. You have to balance a little bit of the fresh air differently than you would with plants, because like us, they're producing the CO2, and they prefer to have the fresh air, especially when it comes to the mushroom form. So when it comes to mushrooms, the fruit itself, the mushroom itself, is like an apple, while fungus or mycelium, those thin white threads that you'll see depending on the species, often hidden under the substrate or on the ground, those thin little threads are mycelium, which makes up the major portion of the organism. It's the whole vegetative state. And so all mushrooms are fungus, but not all fungus will produce mushrooms, right? There's fungus that's going to grow, like what we normally work with is a group of saprophytic fungus. So they're going to work, kind of be like those primary decomposers. As soon as a tree dies or starts to die, things like oysters, different polypores, hericiums, things like that are going to move in, and then start to decompose that. And then there's some different secondary, tertiary decomposers. So some different levels to when the fungi is going to come in and break down the dead material in the forest. There's some that stay in the soils. There's some that communicate and work with symbiotically with plants, whether the inside of roots or just outside of roots. Some fungus is just fully soil living, and some fungus and some mushrooms are actually parasitic. So while they kind of help the ecosystem long term by recycling these nutrients, there are some fungus that will take over some different plants, crops, soils, trees, and take out otherwise healthy organisms in the name of fungus. So again, what we normally work with is going to be Basidiomycota. Usually Basidiomycetes is most of it. That's most of the mushroom producing fungus is going to be Basidiomycetes or Ascomycetes. But most of what we work with is Basidiomycetes and saprophytic fungi. So that's different things like oyster mushrooms, lion's mane, Ganodermas, or reishi, freckled chestnut, you name it, right? Even in the garden, things like wine cap can fit into these categories. And so that's what we're going to be working with. So more than even working with mushrooms, we're working with fungus, and we're working with the mycelium. And so to produce the mushrooms, we have to produce the fungus and produce the mycelium. And so, like I was saying, these fungus that we work with, the saprophytic fungi, that's all what we're cultivating, and those are going to be the ones that break down lignin, into some more different, more available components. So often we're going to be working with a hardwood or a lignin carbonaceous substrate, and then if you mix in some nitrogen, that can often be a feed. So you kind of have to strike that balance, and we'll get into a bunch of recipes and SOPs and kind of how to actually put together some substrates later on. But as just an introduction, we're producing mushrooms, but we're caring for the fungus essentially. So when we're starting to work with fungus and when we're starting to work with mushrooms, we're going to start working with the mycelium, and that can look like a lot of different formats depending on how we're getting into it. So to start, really you want to be able to have a clean area, a clean spot. Maybe you have a flow hood, maybe you have a still air box. There's some different pretty cheap like box fan setups and things you can do for a flow hood. Still air box, you can use just a large Rubbermaid container, but depending on which format, how deep into growing mushrooms you want to get, working with mycelium can look a few different ways. First, my favorite way is using agar. So this species right here, this is a cousin of lion's mane. It is a bear's head, and you can see it's thin, wispy, kind of spotted, kind of cottony, swabby looking little spots on there, and it's the unique aspects of each mycelium in cultivation that tell us what we're working with and how it's reacting. So the agar itself from seaweed, and then it's added in as a gelling agent with some different nutrition to be able to spread, multiply, and store and keep these cultures clean. This one is a golden oaky, and so you can see that's a little thicker, more dense than the Hericium was, that bear's head. And then this one is a oyster. This is a pink oyster, and you can kind of see a little hint of that pink color in there. But it's a real thin, fills out the plate, but really thin and puffy mycelium. So each culture is going to look a little bit different, and using agar can be a little bit difficult to start with. To be able to pour it usually takes a little bit more sterile technique, and to be able to move the transfers over, again, takes a little bit more sterile technique, and we'll get into those in some later videos. But it's not always how people start. So another way a lot of people get into working with mushrooms and fungus and mycelium is going to be through liquid culture. It's a lot more available, it's a lot cheaper, and it's a lot easier for some beginners to be able to work with and get introduced to fungus with this liquid culture. So what a liquid culture is using a mason jar, right? Mycologist's best friends, the mason jars. And inside of it, you can see, is a liquid nutritious media, and those little particles floating around are all little bits, pieces, clumps of mycelium. And so what that is it's a way to reproduce this on a cheaper, faster, larger scale. So oftentimes people will take one of these agar dishes and add it into a sterile liquid culture to then turn that in a couple weeks to this thick colonized broth. The way you receive it online is often going to be with a syringe, usually a lure lock syringe with a little cap on the end, and so those will just pop right on here, and you can suck probably 50 or so of these up depending on how large of a jar you're using. That little bit of mycelium that's in that tube is enough for you to then be able to inoculate sterile grain spawn. So you take that little bit of liquid culture, or you use a section of an agar dish in flow in the still air box, and you inoculate your grain, which will turn that into grain spawn. You can use bags or the mycologist's best friends mason jar, right? Modify the lid, give it a little fresh air. I just keep this aluminum foil just to keep it fresh until I'm ready to use it. Keeps a little extra dust off it. But we'll add a little liquid culture, we'll add a little bit of the agar to this sterile hydrated grain spawn, and we'll have prep on that in a later video as well. And after a couple weeks, that starts to look like this. This is colonized grain spawn. Specifically, this is a phoenix oyster. So very well, fully colonized. And you can see little bits of the grain. It kind of looks like a tempeh, right? And so the mycelium just spreads out over the hydrated and then sterilized grains as the only organism in this bag, and spreads. So this is like our seeds of mushrooms, right? This is our seeded, our way that the spores are. But oftentimes we sprinkle this into our next media, the substrate, and that's what kind of gets to those fruits, those mushrooms in the next steps. So a lot of people will think of grain spawn almost as a seed to begin with, just because there are a bunch of these little grains, and so they're going to be starting the inoculation of a substrate. So maybe as you're starting growing, you're looking into some different options of cultures. You're looking into some different options of how to get growing, and one of them that you might see might be the grain spawn or colonized grain spawn. And what's great about this colonized grain spawn is that I can take this bag, some oftentimes larger bags, but I run these smaller bags. I can break that up and spread it into more grain spawn. And again, I'll use mason jars or bags, it depends. And so I just take a little bit of that colonized spawn and I can add it to a little bit more grain and kickstart that and get more of that going. I can take a couple pieces of that grain and add it to a sterile agar dish, and I can save the culture, restart the culture, get it growing back out. Or I can take a little bit of that grain and spread that grain to a few different substrate bags. And so what that's going to do is then after a couple days start to spread, and this is a hydrated hardwood fuel pellets with soy hull pellets mix. It's probably about 70-30 hardwood fuel pellets to soy hull pellets. And so then I'll take a few of these bags and add a few of these grains to each bag. Depending on the species, you'll use more or less. But then this becomes the inoculant, the grain spawn becomes the inoculant for your substrate. The substrate, this is where the mushrooms are sometimes going to get a little bit extra nutrition, but oftentimes this is the biggest moisture source for your mushrooms. I could take this, I could open this up, and if I'm in a humid area, I could get a few oyster mushrooms off of this. If you let your grain spawn sit, it'll produce some mushrooms. Originally, when people were learning how to grow mushrooms, we were growing them more off of the grain spawn. Then we figured out more advanced ways, more efficient ways. And so to get the most out of that, you'd break that up. You can start some more grain spawn, and then you start a few substrate bags. The substrate itself, like I was saying, I'm running 70% hardwood, 30% soy hull pellets. Depending on which fungus, which mushroom, which mycelium you're working with, they can produce and work with a bunch of different, they can produce a bunch of different enzymes, a bunch of different ways to kind of break down and get into different substrates. So if you're working with things like lion's mane, those really do prefer some hardwood, but things like wine caps can eat wood chips, hardwood, some softer woods, some dead plant materials, some leaves, as well as kind of work within the soils a bit as well, and some composted materials. And then we have some species like oyster mushrooms. Oyster mushrooms are a great mushroom for beginners because they can colonize and fruit off of almost anything, right? You can grow them off the grain, you can grow them off the wood substrate, but you can also grow them off of corn cobs, corn husk. You can grow them off of coffee. They do really good on a lot of different straw, so you can just pretty easily pasteurize some straw, whether with hot water or just a cold lime pasteurization. So you're going to crank that pH up with using some lime in the water with the straw, and then that allows the mycelium to colonize that. So, if you're starting with grain spawn and you're starting a grain spawn mycelium, those are what some of the next steps might look like, right? You might want to save the culture depending on how you're working. If you have a lab set up or if you have some agar dishes. If not, then you can just have some more grain spawn going and be able to kind of kickstart that next round. After a handful of generations and grain to grain to grain to grain, the metabolism can get a little weird, and you can also pick up some little contaminants that way. So every so often, it's good to restart the culture after a couple grain to grain transfers. I only ever really do 2, maybe 3. You can definitely get away with more depending on the output and depending on your scale. But to keep fresh, healthy mycelium is best, just to kind of keep the vigor, keep the youth going, and so that way they're able to kind of rip through the grain spawn. But then, after we take that grain spawn and we mix it into a couple of substrate bags, we get what this is, and this is a ready-to-fruit mushroom block. You might see these online as a ready-to-fruit, ready-to-grow, slice and grow, plant and grow, ready-to-fruit mushroom block, right? So this is a 5-pound bag. Sometimes you'll get a 10-pound bag depending on if you go to a bigger farm. But this is 5 pounds of hydrated, supplemented wood, plus a handful of the colonized grain, and then sealed this up for a couple weeks. Actually, this has only been about 5 days, but this is an oyster variety, so they're pretty fast. And you can see the mycelium then spreads all across, all over, and just engulfs the wood. Right, so there's still that little spot almost that's still trying to go fully in some of the crevices. Right, there's that little bit, but in just 5 days, the mycelium then spread from the little pieces of grain spawn throughout the substrate block and colonized the substrate block. So then, once we have a substrate block, ready to fruit block, whatever it might be, this is a great way to start. If you're just getting into mushrooms, if you're just learning about fungus, mushrooms, and how to work with them, one of the best ways to see if you're interested, and if you want to grow mushrooms and kind of what species may work for you, one of the best ways to get started is with the ready to fruit mushroom blocks. A bunch of farms find it. A bunch of farms produce these. I'm sure you can find a local mushroom farm that produces them. They're a little bit more expensive than doing more of the setup yourself, but you don't need to get any equipment. You don't need to be super sterile. All you have to do is buy one of these blocks, and then you would grab a knife. Right, you can use just a pocket knife, whatever it may be, and depending on the species, the shape will change. But usually you'll just cut a slit diagonal, or an X, or maybe a triangle. For hericiums, lion's mane, I do a diagonal slit. For oysters, I'll do a triangle or an X. Most other species, a triangle or an X. Reishi, I'll leave in the bag so that way they can antler and fruit straight up. So if you're getting into mushrooms, if you're just getting into fungus, a ready-to-fruit bag might be the best move. It doesn't require you to do any prep. It doesn't require you to do any culture maintenance, and it removes as much contamination risk on your end as possible. But then you rely on other people, and so that's where things can get a little hairy depending on the company, depending on shipping, depending on outdoor conditions, temperatures, things like that. We can be fighting different contaminants and shipping some of these blocks and things across country. So supporting local, finding local, growing your own is really the best way to avoid this and keep more of the control in your hands. So whenever we're growing mushrooms, more than anything, this is what it looks like. We're moving around different forms of mycelium, different forms of fungus. The main actual organism, that is, the fungus is its own whole kingdom. So we're using these different medias and different sources to produce the mycelium and the fungus and manipulate it into different forms. So that way, come the end, we can get as many pounds of mushrooms as possible off of just one of these plates. Truly, probably hundreds of pounds, hundreds and hundreds, not probably, but you could produce hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of pounds of mushrooms off of the little material that's in this plate. That takes, obviously, putting it to grain spawn, spreading that grain spawn out, and then putting it into a substrate bag. But the fungus is really what we're working with here when it comes to mushrooms. So this has been just a little bit of an intro about mushrooms, fungus, the organism. Not too in depth. We'll save some of those deep dives and going into the weeds for later on. But it's just important to kind of see some of the different formats and know that what we're working with here when we're trying to grow mushrooms is really fungus and the mycelium that then will produce the mushrooms if we give it a chance. So, any questions, anything at all you're interested in, maybe related to this, trying to get started, reach out, leave a comment, shoot me an email, whatever it may be, and let's get you myceliated, let's get you further growing, and let's figure out what some of these hiccups, what some of these issues, or some of your thoughts may be, and so that maybe you can help me grow and improve. So, reach out, connect, and let's keep growing. Let's work with some fungus. Let's work with some mycelium. Get yourself a fruiting block. If you're just getting started, I'm telling you, you literally buy one of these, and you cut it with a knife, stab it. And in a handful of weeks, not every species, right? And you gotta have the right conditions, but you put it on your kitchen counter, and in a couple days, couple weeks, you'll have a mushroom. So, while we want to grow mushrooms, really what we're doing is growing fungus in a bunch of different various forms. So, thank you. Ask questions. Keep getting better. Let's keep learning.